You're not free. You're not even close to free.
Ils font noir de notre peine, ils font rouge de notre sang.
In the last episode, you learned that it's finally time to storm the cockpit and take control of your future. Because the pilot is suicidal, the plane is upside down, on fire, and out of gas. So let's roll!
Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, bing, bing. You know what that is, right? God bless the United States.
Admittedly, it's been fun, guys. But now the lulls are over. If Supreme Leader for Life Dirty Grandpa taught the American electorate anything, and the right wing in particular, then it's that even a protest vote doesn't work in a repressive or fake democracy. And so if you want to drain the swamp, you're going to have to get off your red and blue butt and do it all by your little old self.
This is him just 1 month after his election, essentially telling everyone to their faces that the phrase was meaningless.
Funny how that term caught on, isn't it? I tell everyone, I hated it. Somebody said, drain the swamp. I said, oh, that's so hokey. That is so terrible. I said, all right, I'll try it. So like a month ago, I said, drain the swamp. The place went crazy. I said, whoa, what's this? Then I said it again. Then I started saying it like I meant it, right?
The reason we softened you up with a little lesson in Constitutional Democracy 101 back in 2016 was not only for the lulls, but also in order to make your rigid and blinkered ideas about democracy a little more malleable. Hopefully by now you've all learned that no elected representative whatsoever, not even an unrestrained tyrant orange, is ever going to do your dirty work for you. So wake up and grow up. No one is ever going to take their hands out of your pockets to soil them on your behalf, least of all our troll-in-chief, Dirty Grandpa.
We are looking at putting in a very major tax cut for middle-income people. And if we do that, it'll be sometime just prior, I would say, to November. A major tax cut. 10% tax cut for middle-income families. It's going to be put in next year. Liar! 10% tax cut.
But now that cypherpunks have pooped on your precious representative or phony democracy, where are you going to go next? By making a mockery out of the voting system, we forced you into a position where you have to have change. But as they taught you in school, if you want change, then you have to vote. So now you're well and truly stuck, because as you now know, if voting were really capable of changing things, then obviously they would have made it illegal long ago.
Politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything.
Now it's time for the 45 to unhero himself by sticking his head down the throat of the deep state, and for us to begin phase 2 of Operation POTUS Troll. Welcome to the American Spring. Although the Arab Spring failed, there are 2 important lessons to learn from it. The first is that the establishment is in a very vulnerable position, and in the modern age is relatively easy to topple them legally with a social media-driven non-violent revolution. And no, Fox News, those laser pointers are not the people celebrating. Those are the people blinding the army surveillance helicopter that's trying to take their pictures to use later for reprisals. That kind of coordinated mass action against oppression comes courtesy of social media, and in spite of the mainstream media. But it's illegal, and if you do the slightest thing illegal in this casino gulag, they will use it as an excuse to string you up. So don't. Because you don't even have to. I'll tell you why shortly. The second lesson from the Arab Spring is now loud and clear. Unless the people have a unified and clear vision about where to go next after a successful revolution, then things are likely to backfire, possibly get violent, and you're liable to wind up in a worse position than you were before. If you don't have a clear vision about where the revolution is headed next, then religious radicals and extremists dressed in alien cortex monochrome will be more than happy to show you. So don't lose control of the agenda to them. They always try to foment chaos in order to convince a frightened public that it needs them to restore order. It's the oldest trick in the tyrant's toolbox.
This message must resound throughout the entire interlink. I want this country to realize that we stand on the edge of oblivion. I want every man, woman and child to understand how close we are to chaos. I want everyone to remember why they need us.
Even celebrating on the streets after a win looks like chaos to people at home, so don't do it. Therefore, it's important that when the American spring comes, people are prepared and know what the plan is, and navigate it together in lockstep like a well-oiled machine. So are you ready? Well, here's the plan. Simply put, in order to save yourselves, you need to cut the bull and implement direct democracy, and fairly urgently. That's not what democracy looks like. That's what powerless, disenfranchised idiots look like. And the elites are just laughing at you. Look guys, if you carry on treating those malfeasant representatives you elected as your parents, then they're going to carry on treating you like naughty children acting out.
The ultimate problem with protests is that when you do street protests alone, there's a certain point at which there's nowhere else to go. Like Occupy was the biggest, the loudest, and after a certain point, you can't be any bigger, you can't be any louder.
There are two types of politicians: those that are trash, and those that soon will be.
Trust in me, just in me.
Power corrupts, so just bypass them. Direct democracy is true democracy without filth, where you crowdsource the law and decision-making directly from the public online through e-voting, instead of electing corporate pork puppets to Capitol Hill to disappoint you. The current system was born out of the practical limitations of communications back in the days of the horse-drawn buggy, when the Founding Fathers first drafted their failed Declaration of Independence from the banksters. Since they didn't have electronic communication systems back then, you had to elect a representative to go to Washington to represent you. But that's no longer the case. Now that you have modern telecommunications, that old archaic representative democracy thing is completely obsolete. Since it's proven itself to be corrupt, unfair, inept and broken, it's time to repeal it and replace it with a Democracy 2.0 upgrade. But how? Well, this is what worked for us on the planet elsewhere, and so I suggest you do the same. The basic strategy is a two-pronged attack. 1. You create a secure, public, open-source software online direct democracy system. 2. You launch a grassroots kamikaze party designed to force through a constitutional amendment to repeal representative or fake democracy and replace it with your online direct democracy system. It's as simple as that. First, let me sketch out what an online direct democracy voting system looks like. Superficially, it works like a wiki. Think Wikipedia, but for crowdsourcing the law rather than the pages in an encyclopedia. Anyone, even you, can create a page in Wikipedia, and anyone can alter that page. That's a little impractical for a legal system, so in a direct democracy system, the public votes on each change before it becomes law. This is how it works.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill.
Anyone can draft a bill and upload it as a proposal. Then any registered, eligible voter can go online and give it a thumbs up or thumbs down at the level of the whole bill, any paragraph within the bill, or any line within a paragraph. And they can propose and submit edits of their own to the vote, or have sidebar comments and discussions about any aspects of the bill in order to debate the merits or demerits. And comments can be up and down voted as well. Now your primate brain may be thinking to itself,
"Are you kidding? Seriously, that's your idea of fun?"
All this sounds like more effort than you probably have time or patience for. You probably already think voting in the occasional elections is a tedious chore that's almost too much to bear, So going online every day to craft the law sounds worse than root canal therapy or being forced to watch C-SPAN all day. In truth, what you'll discover is that the average person very rarely needs to vote. You only go online to vote on things you really care about, and you can set things up to get alerts when those issues come up. And if that's even too much trouble for you, then the system allows you to appoint someone as your voting representative, much like today. Unless you choose to go online to override their decisions, which you could do at any time. In practice, only self-selected experts wind up drafting legislation, and it naturally becomes a qualified vote because the unqualified citizens voluntarily self-filter by human nature. This system is designed to put your collective alien cortex in the driver's seat, but not as master, rather as chauffeur. Once in harness, it can start the long and painful process of reforming itself for the good of mankind, rather than the other way round, as is currently the case. Say goodbye to demagoguery and tyranny, because people like this reptilian-brained guy are about as likely to go online and vote as they are to sit down and watch an hour of C-SPAN, and that's a relief for everyone, including him. In a healthy society, the law should be sourced from people with the mindset of stamp collectors, librarians, scholars, scientists, small-minded pedants, and experts in their respective fields, like the admirable folks who currently devote their time to curating Wikipedia pages and keeping them up to date. A healthy legal system is very square, conservative, and super boring. A sure sign that your society has gone off the rails is when politics gets exciting and newsworthy. There should never be vibrant debate in a functional democracy. If politics is exciting, it means your society is sick and democracy is ailing. Now I think I can hear your mammalian brain saying something like,
But what about non-technical people? What about people too poor to get online? What about disabled people and grandma? Won't direct democracy disenfranchise people like that?
The answer is that's a sidebar issue of accessibility. It should be tackled as a separate technical problem, and it should not cloud or compromise the overall vision for the system. Now your alien cortex is probably thinking,
How can this ever work? The electorate is too dumb to even elect a decent representative in the current system. How on earth do you expect them to actually craft responsible and halfway decent laws?
It's an uncomfortable truth in liberal democracies that, just like Socrates, everyone secretly despises their fellow Democrats. I would point out to that conceited alien cortex of yours that you should never champion direct democracy as a panacea and cure-all for your broken political system and bad government. Rather think of it as a learning machine with built-in pain feedback. A vehicle designed to educate the population and to make them wisen up. Direct democracy is the benevolent cure for the unscrupulous diner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons, but admittedly under the yoke of a kind of socialism where you tend to get told by your fellow citizens what to dine on and how much of the commons you can use. But don't judge the future potential of the system by current standards. In a representative democracy, you can vote for lower taxes at the same time as you can vote for more government spending, but that's not so easy with direct democracy. You can't fix stupidity, but a system like this can sure make it hurt. At the moment, it's easy for masses of disenfranchised people to behave like unruly morons at the back of the bus. That's the way the establishment wants things. So they, like Plato, can make the argument that you need them in the driving seat. But it's quite a different matter when the people actually find themselves at the wheel, with direct responsibility, and no one to blame for their own mistakes. That's hardly ever happened before on a national scale. Don't judge until you've given the people a chance. If it doesn't work, you can easily convert the direct democracy system back into a representative democracy and carry on. What would you prefer? To gamble on this experiment or gamble on avoiding violent revolution?
There is a pattern of preachers wanting high-end airplanes.
I had enough money to buy a beautiful Cessna Citation jet, cash. And since there's so much jealousy in this room tonight that I can feel over this.
It may take a little while for the population to learn to drive responsibly, but in practice getting down to the nuts and bolts and actually crafting and wordsmithing laws is quite different to voting for representatives, propositions and referendums, which generally wind up engaging the lower brain layers in the neural stack, to the detriment of everyone. It's easy for rabble-rousing demagogues to manipulate the electorate's reptilian brains with lies and scaremongering, but emotive hot-button issues soon become irrelevant if the electorate has to get straight down to the nitty-gritty of the law to sort out the devilish details of actually crafting the final legislation. The BS and hoopla end right there and then. Bigoted questions of who and what are quickly superseded by more intellectual practicalities of things like the how and the when. Debate around those issues is more mature and relevant, and that leads naturally to more sober questions like why. Also, at this stage you have to be living under a rock not to have found out about the awesome latent potential of collective intelligence, the hive mind and crowdsourcing solutions in general. If all this is new to you, then perhaps you ought to start with The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki and go from there. The American aristocracy and their flunkies want you to believe that there's no such thing as collective intelligence, because that could cost them their necks. Remember, stuffy hidebound alien cortexes lined up to scoff at Wikipedia when it first came out, until peer-reviewed research showed that its content was not only vastly more extensive, but as factually accurate as the foremost commercial expert encyclopedias of the day. Game, set and match to the great unwashed. Now let's Wikipedia the law. At this point, some conformist normie weasel that's been through the system but is too dumb to actually question it is bound to dutifully regurgitate this old saw.
But won't this just lead to tyranny of the majority?
Well, of course it will, clever clocks, but that's all part of the people's learning process. People get the rulers they deserve, and the harshest rulers are themselves. But that's okay. The people need to teach themselves to be kind to themselves. And what exactly would you prefer? Perpetual tyrannies of the plutocratic minority like you have at the moment? A tyranny of one malignant dictator? Don't forget that the crew currently on the flight deck is suicidal, so even a chocolate toothbrush or cotton candy dental floss would be more effective at their job than what you have now. Although the public doesn't know it yet, World War III is already raging in cyberspace, and behind the scenes the last few election results were really the outcomes of clandestine cyber wars fought on the web, rather than a reflection of how the voting public actually cast their ballots. Thanks to cyber hacking, the electoral process itself is now a mockery of democracy, and I'm not just talking about fake news, bots and trolling on Facebook and anti-social media.
But how can you guarantee that there is only one master direct democracy system? What stops competing systems?
The answer is nothing at all. Although it goes against your primate brain instincts, in reality you should celebrate a multiplicity of systems. The perfect ideal is that eventually everyone has one. Every governing body, from corporate boards to academic faculty, project teams, even church and family, and even every military unit. And when you get to the point that everyone has his or her own personal direct democracy system just for themselves, then government finally becomes meaningless, and you have all arrived at the anarchic ideal, where everyone just governs himself or herself.
Just how long do you think this peace is going to last?
As long as it can.
In the meantime, as a token gesture to your primate brain, part of a system's charter is to specify any superior direct democracy system, if any, that it is subordinate to. So your preferred local government direct democracy system should be subordinate to some other statewide system, and that would name some superior federal system in a typical old primate-brained hierarchy. Hopefully a plethora of such systems and even hierarchies emerge, and one will finally surface as the best of breed and an easy pick in a public referendum immediately after the American Spring. On the planet elsewhere, we eventually got to the point where all national direct democracy systems voluntarily subordinated themselves to one global direct democratic system. Although their votes don't necessarily have to count in the final outcome, nothing should stop people from other nations voting in foreign systems. So, for illustration, you could instantly see what, say, Swedes or Chinese think about your American agricultural policies before they even passed into law, even though their votes don't directly determine the final result. Once things quiet down a bit, you can get to the point where any national can vote in any other nation's system and have their votes actually count. At that point, war is pretty much meaningless and obsolete. In the end, even the elites can have their beloved New World Order, and conspiracy theorists don't even have to go nuts about it, because it's a global government by the people, for the people, and not the elites for a change. And even the elites should grudgingly celebrate that, because currently they're heading for the sharp ends of pitchforks when they can no longer deliver on the promise of perpetual growth. You're welcome, Mr. Moneybags. You'll find the link to Patreon down below. At this stage, we've probably come to the first decent question yet.
Okay, everybody knows what you've said so far, but how do you replace the existing system? That's the real trick.
That's where the fun starts. Say hello to the political suicide party.
Squad! Hallelujah! Commit suicide! Stand up, all of you! Oh my, heck, is there not even one dead?
No, sir, not one.
Why not?
They thought it was a practice, sir.
The best way to get rid of your suicidal pilots and crew is to storm the cockpit with a kamikaze party. A kamikaze party is dedicated to being elected to government so that it can pass legislation to abolish the House and Senate in favor of direct internet democracy and e-voting. It's designed to replace the current two-party state and its bipartisan eco-genocide politics with a national public online direct democracy system. If the kamikaze party ever gets a supermajority, then divisive party politics fueled by anti-social media can be a thing of the past. Put yourself forward as a kamikaze candidate at all levels of government, local, state and federal.
The NRA is still a very powerful force in this country. They have 4 million members who are very, very determined to get their way.
And how can a nation of 300 million compete with that?
Taking on the NRA can be political suicide.
And the Democratic Party is working tirelessly to reduce the rate of political suicide among its members. Surely Australian politicians weren't stupid enough to end their political lives for gun control.
Well, I did. Being a kamikaze candidate is simple. All you have to do is to take a pledge to uphold roughly the following general oath. If elected to government, I will enter any legislation that comes before the body I'm elected to into the online direct democracy system for pre-review. I will abstain from all votes except on the following 2 issues. First, I will work tirelessly to promote an open internet and defend internet freedom and neutrality, and against any form of online shutdown, censorship, suppression of information, and all corporate intellectual property rights and corporate or other organized interference in the digital domain. Second, I will do everything legally within my power to force through a constitutional amendment to abolish the current legislative body I'm elected to and replace it with a direct democracy system chosen by the people in a binding referendum. The actual wording of the oath is one of the foundation stones of whichever online direct democracy system you prefer to pledge allegiance to. Make a video of yourself taking the oath. Finish and sign it by flossing. Make this sign, then post it on the web. Flossing is the new toy. Google it. Any online direct democracy system needs to start by crowdsourcing and finalizing 3 foundation documents ratified using a supermajority. 1. Its charter, including jurisdiction, and the court of law or body that will act as its judiciary, and where it sits in a legislative hierarchy, if any, and how and where it's hosted. 2. The governing rules of the system, including limits, what constitutes a quorum, a majority, a supermajority, and how voters become eligible, register, deregister, and how they identify themselves to the system. 3. The specific oath binding anyone who wants to run as a kamikaze candidate for the system. In the past, this was the rule.
Now, stop voting, stop pretending, wake up. Be in reality now. Now, why vote? We know it's not going to make any difference. We know that already. But I say when there is a genuine alternative, a genuine option, then vote for that. But until then, don't bother.
Now, finally, with a kamikaze candidate in place, you can afford to get out and vote again. You finally have a viable alternative, and you will not be throwing your vote away either. As most people have figured out by now, the two-party system is designed by the elites to ensure the status quo. Up until now, they forced you to vote for Tweedledum to make sure that Tweedledee doesn't get into office. Although both Tweedledee and Tweedledum are in their pockets, and both rotten choices, you have no realistic options, because if you vote for the third-party candidate, you're splitting the vote for Tweedledum at best, and at worst you're just throwing your vote away on an unelectable third-party candidate. Not anymore. A kamikaze candidate breaks that paradigm. It's a protest vote. Essentially, it gives you what the establishment would never dare give you at the moment. It effectively allows you to vote for none of the above.
I figure voting for Salvino or Heller is just as silly as them running for office, which is just as silly as me running for office. The only thing not silly is the power of the people's vote. And I think the people should use it to vote for none of the above.
Even if your kamikaze candidate is not elected, the vote count sends a powerful quantitative warning message to the elites on exactly how fed up the voters are with the current system, on a scale from 1 to annihilation of Capitol Hill.
They blew up Congress!
Figuratively speaking, of course. And you don't have to worry about the Tweedledum and Tweedledee problem of selecting the lesser of two evils. Since your kamikaze candidate has pledged to abstain from all voting, it makes them a safe lamb to put in office, no matter which side of the fence you're on. The only issues they will vote on is to protect internet freedom, restore internet freedoms you recently lost, and to demolish the whole phony democratic system in favor of direct democracy, just as soon as they can muster a constitutional majority. Since kamikaze candidates have pledged to abstain once in office, there's no reason for two kamikaze candidates to run against each other for the same seat. They can just decide via a coin toss who gets to run as the kamikaze candidate, to make sure that there's only ever one kamikaze nominee per seat, and kamikaze candidates don't wind up splitting each other's vote. Once the kamikaze candidate has been decided via coin toss, it frees up other would-be kamikaze candidates to run in stealth as spoilers for the incumbent parties. They can even mimic the platforms of the oppression party candidates, and so wind up splitting their votes and weakening their positions, or wind up forcing them into the margins and into political positions they wouldn't otherwise take in order to differentiate themselves. And if you happen to have a surprise win as a stealth incumbent in one of the oppression parties, nothing stops you coming out as a kamikaze candidate later once you're in office. I eagerly look forward to the day when oppression party candidates tear themselves apart, accusing each other of being kamikaze candidates in disguise. Or is it a lamb in wolf's clothing? But don't get me wrong, just because you've pledged voting abstention doesn't mean that you have to be non-vocal if you're elected to office. On the contrary, kamikaze candidates should try to be as disruptive as legally possible in the Legislative Assembly in order to sabotage it to the full extent allowed by law. A kamikaze president, for example, would just use their V for veto power on all bills or joint resolutions and return them to the houses. Otherwise, they would do pretty much nothing all day except issue executive orders to free up the internet and stop mass surveillance on the web. I would suggest wearing a Guy Fawkes mask or one like this at every possible assembly, and filibustering on every possible occasion by reading Mein Kampf, or Das Kapital, or the 2,000-page bumper edition of Elementary Democracy for Dummies to them. Or keeping the mirror in mind, how about reading the rotten laws they've already passed back to them, the most egregious, pork-laden, unjust and embarrassing ones first? I'm not sure. Are you allowed to read out the secret clauses of the Patriot Act in open Congress? No? Am I the only one that finds that a little weird in a democracy?
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Sure, they might pass legislation prohibiting Guy Fawkes masks and kamikaze tactics and trolling in the House, but just think about it. That might just be the first honestly self-censoring legislation that some of these bodies have ever passed. And getting them to look at themselves in the mirror like that would be a triumph of democracy in itself. Maybe if they get used to self-censure, they might start passing serious campaign finance reform or anti-bribery legislation and cleaning up their act. According to your pledge, one of the duties of a kamikaze candidate would be to refer any potential legislation tabled in an assembly for shadow review by the direct democracy system. The idea is to have the system track representatives and limit a politician's ability to misrepresent their constituents. That way, their constituents could broadcast their preferences online, right down to the last pork-laden crony capitalist clause in a bill. That would allow representatives' voting records to be tracked, so a representative's democracy gap could be highlighted. Perhaps eventually a democracy gap score from 0 to 1 can replace this D or R here. That way, exemplary politicians prove that they are redundant and sinners are voted out for misrepresentation. By shadowing and mirroring government and the legislature in this way, the public direct democracy system could safely prove itself and gain credibility, while people adjust to the idea of having genuine democracy at their fingertips for the very first time. At first it's a vox populi megaphone to telegraph the popular will to officials. Eventually the training wheels can come off and the system can smoothly replace them. But in practice, the training wheels may never come off. You may never get the constitutional majority for implementing direct democracy and turning both houses into museums. But it hardly matters if you can terrify the establishment into thinking you could at any time, and someday might if they put a foot wrong.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Just imagine the elite's terror as they watch the ebb and flow in the tide of white mass in the chamber, petrified of the day they might personally screw up, invoking the public's wrath and accidentally pushing them over the brink. The point of no return, a fatal two-thirds majority in both houses as defined in the Constitution by Article V. Ideally, the system should be in place, primed, proven and tested before the banksters engineer their next major financial collapse. Their next financial collapse trick could trigger a popular kamikaze backlash that could sweep the kamikaze party along to its final goal, its own extinction and theirs. Kamikaze means divine wind, and it's high time that your masters were thrown off their golden sedan chairs by such a wind blowing through the corridors of power. And no one knows that better than them. But the Sirius Institute can't be seen to lead the charge on any of this. Our profile is already too high. It's crucially important that the American Spring has no leadership, otherwise the establishment just does their usual tired-old trick, where they single out the popular leaders and make examples out of them, Braveheart style.
Cry out. Mercy.
Once these authoritarian terrormongers get the public's reptilian brain to kick in, then everyone flees and that's the end of the revolution. And then Grandma's mammalian brain goes tut-tut, and then it's back to alien cortex slavery once again. So never forget, no gods, no masters, no alien cortexes. But in the short term, in order to liberate yourselves, you need alien cortex volunteers with software skills to start contributing code to a public open source software project for direct democracy. That might pose an unexpected challenge. Software programmers with talent and ambition are notoriously self-serving and antisocial. Basically, they're alien cortexes. So you tend to find childish books about objectivism written by this wild-eyed loon on their desks. Rather than helping humanity, they tend to dream about becoming like Zuck and leaving humanity behind. If you don't have programming skills yourself, then perhaps you can devote your time and resources to persuading geeks in Silicon Valley that in this day and age, pounding the pavement down Sand Hill Road looking for venture capital is about as virtuous and fruitless as just pounding sand. And while we're on the subject of silicon, it's only a matter of time before some blockheads suggest implementing the direct democracy system using the blockchain. At that point, I recommend taking them round the back of the woodshed and giving them the treatment they gave the fake shamans at Göbekli Tepe. Whatever you do, do not implement a direct democracy system using blockchain technology, or it'll be compromised before you even start. I'll go into details in a later episode, but for now understand that Bitcoin and the blockchain were always just a sting operation from the Satoshi Nakamoto agency. It's going to be technically challenging enough to implement a direct democracy system that is hack-proof. But rest assured, if you use blockchain technology or anything like it, your system will be compromised by the deep state from the outset, just as thoroughly as they currently own and hack the existing voting machines. Just so you know, you can't even rely on public-private key cryptography for securing direct democracy. Satoshi's organization computed the full set of private keys for 1024-bit encryption way back in the 90s. And any 2048-bit keys or higher you use that they haven't computed all the possible private keys for yet is handled by their pals who make the hardware chips and microcode in your machine. Hint, there are just a few hokey-pokey steps to make that random number generator in your computer stop generating truly random numbers. So a seriously challenging part of making an open-source direct democracy system is that you need to completely reinvent the current standard cryptographic methods, which are about as secure as a blockchain bungee cord when faced with the cryptographic capabilities of the deep state today. So maybe the first people you need to recruit to design and build your new online system might be disaffected people at Satoshi's old agency, or even the B team. After all, they all made a solemn pledge to defend and uphold the Constitution, and some of them, like the shadow brokers, Snowden, Binney, Drake, Tam, and many others, are really bright. So many of them have already figured out that the biggest threat facing the US Constitution at the moment is the organizations they currently draw salaries from, unfortunately paid for by taxpayers like you. The alphabet soup organizations have put more software and hardware backdoors into this venerable and vulnerable old icon of yours than Hal's Moving Castle, or maybe Kafka's. A shackle icon like this citizen monitoring device is really just the modern electronic ankle bracelet for the social fragmentation, electronic tracking, and radio control of the people. So the granddaddy of all trolls is forging these shackles into swords of liberation. It can be done. With your help, these devices might be destined to become the backbone of a secure, decentralized, cross-verifiable online direct democracy system, if you can solve the challenges without using the blockchain. So in order to escape phony democracy, hack your phone, and do it while that's still possible. Don't forget that this device serves as your de facto microchip before they get bold enough to just inject it directly into puppies like you. After the American Spring, all the anti-democratic, unconstitutional alphabet soup agencies and secret prisons can be defunded and shut down by the people, and the few agencies left can be used to monitor and secure the direct democracy system itself, just like with any other boring public utility or piece of strategic national infrastructure. But you better act soon, before your great leader and president for life orders them to start microchipping you for real, starting with felons and graduating to you as every member of the public is slowly turned into a felon. There's one final thing worth mentioning that you can use your direct democracy system for in its proving period before the American Spring. You can use it to craft what we call PCs, or People's Contracts. People's contracts are standard contracts that govern all sorts of commercial and legal agreements between citizens and organizations. On the planet elsewhere, we had a People's Standard Contract drafted from our direct democracy system by popular vote for almost everything you currently sign custom agreements for on Earth. These days you are unfairly forced to sign one-sided agreement after agreement with unscrupulous organizations that are cunningly crafted by teams of legal experts to screw you, the little guy. And your law courts uphold these sham agreements and pretend that they are equitable and fair, are signed between equals, and meet the basic contractual standard of a meeting of minds. even though they clearly don't. Most people are subtly coerced into signing because, practically speaking, they don't have any choice, which should automatically invalidate the contract, and yet it doesn't. There is no way there can possibly be a meeting of minds between a large corporation and their customers or victims. Almost none of the people who will sign these legally binding agreements have any legal training whatsoever, or the time to even read the contracts that corporations use to legally bind them. So to tilt things in the favor of the people, rather than the corporations, we used our direct democracy system to crowdsource standard, fair agreements that citizens then imposed on corporations and organizations, rather than the other way round. Any corporation that refused to do business according to the standard PC contract for their business type, service or product, or insisted on drafting their own agreements or making amendments, found themselves boycotted by the people. They can no longer get you with the fine print because they no longer get to write it. The establishment made contract law exceedingly strong in order to bind you. PCs leveraged that strength to bind and screw them in return. The muscle in contract law immediately skirts round or trumps most of the unfair legislation that American corporations have bought from government through a sewer system of corruption over many decades. Since you can put just about anything you like in a PC contract, you can in effect force laws on corporations by dint of the terms of the standard contract. Terms that your pork puppets currently refuse to put into law due to their conflicted loyalties and malfeasance. If corporations, say banks for example, collude and refuse to do business according to the standard PC agreement for retail or commercial banking, then the people should take the initiative and open up their own banks that are PC. So when it comes to employment, you don't have to wait for politicians or union negotiators to impose a minimum wage, or fair working conditions, or even reasonable benefits. You just put whatever you think is fair in the people's standard employment contract. If your employer refuses to sign it, then just walk out and go and work for somebody who will, assuming of course you work in one of the few monopsony-free industries left. I leave it up to you to decide whether to blackball and shame employees that knuckle under and sign corporate-imposed employment contracts, but I would heartily recommend selecting, shaming and boycotting the employers. So make them do business the PC way, or it's the highway. These are all things you can do prior to the American Spring. Nothing stops you from doing it tomorrow even. And while you're at it, why not trademark a PC seal of approval and impose it on all consumer goods?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word. Plastics. There's a great future in plastics. Think about it.
Plastic production globally this year is expected to be more than 300 million tonnes.
Half of which we'll use just once and then throw away. By 2050, when the population explodes to almost 10 billion people, it's expected that plastic production will triple. The problem with that is that today only a fraction of the plastic that we produce is recycled. The rest ends up in our environment, and it's coating our land and our oceans like a disease.
If you really want to clean up the environment, for example, stop picking up corporations' trash for them. Just make social and environmental responsibility a part of the PC buyer's agreement for commercial products they produce and specify the penalties in order to become PC. The Certified Organic Labeling Initiative failed and became corrupted because corporations drafted and therefore owned that agreement. But PC agreements and the standards they set are owned by the people themselves and crowdsourced from the applicable direct democracy system. But won't that just drive up the cost of products, you might ask? Yes, it will. But that's just one of the benefits. It'll slow the economy down, and that will help the environment. But won't that mean lost jobs? Hopefully, yes. And a self-imposed jobs crisis will hopefully help people to start questioning their support of the wage slavery system and their toxic and upside-down view of labor and compensation in general. Most of all, if people have the means at their disposal to force corporations to behave in a socially responsible way, that will drive up the cost of products and force consumers to do a more accurate whole cost accounting for their shopping mania and lethal civilization addiction. By now you may have realized online direct democracy is not really intended as a tool for sourcing democracy. It's ultimately a speed learning tool for sourcing accelerated mass psychotherapy. And the mass psychotherapy is necessary to prevent your eco-genocide. Psychotherapy is no easy ride, and neither is online direct democracy. The really hard part comes after the electronic revolution and your social emancipation. Once you have direct democracy after the American Spring, the people are going to have to move very fast in order to hold on to power. The success or failure of the revolution relies on the very first pieces of legislation that need to be passed by your nascent direct democracy system in order to make sure that it's not snuffed out in its crib by the inevitable counter-revolution. You have to use it to pass some crucial and revolutionary bits of legislation, and I'll share those with you in part 2 of this episode. Until then, you slacktivists stay off the streets and safely on your couches or in your cubicle cells, popping your Paxil with icon in hand and weaponized and at the ready. And maybe indulge in a little social activist software programming too. Don't code for money, code for change. Do everything you can to make sure the revolution is popular but not televised. Care and share, but make sure you don't give the mainstream media any spectaculars on the streets to televise. They have to keep it simple, so make it complex. They have to keep it short and punchy, so make it long and boring. But still consumable if you care, like we've tried to do in this video series. Hide political dynamite under a bushel, and then hide the bushel in plain sight, in a dense, boring thicket where no AI or algorithms can easily find you. Help to spread the whisper through the deafening noise. Stay out of the limelight and at the same time make rapid progress off camera. It's like a game of freeze tag. Freeze in the spotlight, strike in the dark. Otherwise you'll just freak out Grandma's mammalian brain and Grandpa's reptilian brain, and if you lose them, then the revolution will be lost through their clueless confusion at the polling booth. For the moment, the only sensible reason you can have for going out into the streets of protest now is to tell the Occupy movement to shove their placards up their asses and stop making fools out of themselves, or to tell political protesters to save their time and energy and to stop scaring Grandma and Grandpa. If you try to have a peaceful march these days, you know they'll just do what they always do. They'll just put agent provocateurs among you to smash a few windows and then turn the whole thing violent, so their buddies in the mainstream media can make you look bad.
Why don't we see liberals act more aggressively when it comes to condemning violence like this?
Their anti-rule of law message spreading throughout the country, these self-described anarchists fighting for a nation of no borders and doing everything in their power to keep ICE from doing their jobs.
Find out how to put an end to those kinds of shenanigans by watching the next episode. And good luck with your kamikaze candidacy. As a legal alien, I look forward to voting for you in the next election. And hopefully that'll be the last. And by the way, I would suggest you start downloading the videos in this series and begin circulating them on thumb drives, because the time for them all to be taken down is fast approaching.
You didn't see anything, right? We don't belong here. It's just not natural. This is all some kind of whacked out conspiracy.
Wild? You could actually go there? That sounds great.
The copyright on the videos in this series belongs to the Creative Commons, so copy the whole series onto 2 memory sticks, give them to 2 people, tell them to do the same, and so on. Some people have already cracked some of the clues and made it through to the trailheads, and soon a time will come when future videos in this series are circulated through them. When that happens, if you want to carry on watching, you'll have to get in touch with someone who has a gold maple in his or her possession, or alternatively just make sure you're one of them.
You played a very dangerous game.
What about the others?
What others?
The ones that want out.
Obviously they will be freed.
I have your word.
What do you think I am? Human?
In the next episode, I'll dive into some of the crucial steps you'll have to take in order to consolidate your victory after the American Spring. And you'll have to move fast. There won't be much time for celebrating because the counter-revolutionaries will be out to get you with a vengeance.